everybody. Thank you for joining us here, both here and online. I got a lot of folks there as well. This is our last Kroc Pot of the semester. I want to thank Daria again for just coordinating not only this, but the entire series. I think that it's really been really kind of like a stellar lineup, and I think it's pretty appropriate that we end with our own students. So every year, students here, the master's students here have an option if they have a high enough GPA of doing a master's thesis. And it's not exactly something that we definitely don't put them to do it because it's a lot more work for us as well. But these four have opted into it, and I couldn't be happier that they did. So we'll have 4 students that have been working for the past year, and in the case of Stella, less than a year, but putting in a year's worth of work in a very short amount of time to catch up. So we will be we'll be allowing them each to sort of run through their own projects. They have mapped these projects out from the beginning. They've sketched out their methodologies, the research questions that they're looking to tackle, how they're going to tackle them. And they've been working on this, as I said, since the beginning of the fall semester. We're going to go sort in a sequence that we agreed upon in class. And I believe that the sequence, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, goes like this. First, Madison Turnin is going to, or at least her spirit, will be presenting for her. She has recorded her presentation already. She is currently in Argentina on the practicum with Jake Walcrea. And so she will be exploring the sort of potential complementarity between human rights advocacy and restorative justice within the sort of international peace building realm. Then Ana Carolina will be looking at how international protection discourses construct these liminal figures, people who don't either fall into the categories of exclusion or inclusion, and that sort of by design in certain cases. We will then have Stella Bosch explore the phenomenon of grassroots NGOs that are small but located oftentimes in the global north, and how they can facilitate local connections between large international professionalized NGOs and local NGOs. And then the only person in the flesh is Caitlin, who will be investigating how peace infrastructure right here in Linda Vista both facilitates and obstructs community peace building. So without further ado, I guess we should invite Madison
I
to
have
the
the recording,
stage.
so hopefully we can hear it all.
Hi everyone. Unfortunately, I was not able to join you in person today, but I sent in this pre-recorded video filmed on Friday, May 9th to discuss my research and hopefully connect with you guys in future. So today I'll be talking about my honors project, Connecting Human Rights to Restorative Justice, Complementary Approaches to International Advocacy. So before I jump into the scope of this project, I thought it was important to situate who I am and where this project emerged from. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Madison Turnin. I am graduating at the end of this month from the MAPJ program. This project emerged from both my past peace building work and who I've been as a student during my time at Kroc, as well as how I plan to continue my education. So as an undergrad at Pace University, I worked at UN headquarters. Within the system, I worked for the Working Group on Girls, the World Council of Churches, and ACT Alliance. My focus with these organizations was on girls' rights within the broader scope of gender justice and human rights. When I came to Kroc, my focus shifted towards restorative justice. I completed the certification that is offered jointly between Kroc and Souls, and I have been teaching classes for the past 6 months at MCC, the Downtown Federal Facility for Incarcerated Women, on reentry skills. And so that looks at accountability, goal setting, communication, and preparing themselves to reenter society. I plan to continue my education post-graduation, and so this project also emerged to fulfill the dissertation proposal that I needed to submit to apply for doctoral programs. So now jumping into what my project seeks to understand, I noticed as both an undergrad and a graduate student that peace building is often taught within silos. So the human rights classes focus specifically on international law and human rights advocacy. The restorative justice classes focus on specifically the criminal justice system, the education system, and applying new holistic means of justice seeking. And while the two have practices that could inform each other, the classes don't overlap. And so a lot of the work is placed onto students to make these connections. And I started to question, well, if we are keeping these silos within the education sphere and as well as the research sphere, how could that impact advocacy and peace building in practice? Thus, creating the problem statement. Are the silos we theorize and teach in peace studies shaping how we approach practices of peace building? This could also be given vice versa. Do the ways we approach practices as silos impact the way we teach and theorize within silos? And then specifically pulling in on my background, I wanted to know if restorative justice practices could close the gaps within the international human rights advocacy system. So when we're looking at the critiques of human rights, can the practices emerging from restorative justice respond to those? So to situate this project within the existing literature, I'm again looking at the critiques of international human rights. And so this includes the Western foundations of the international system. Many argue that because it is very Euro-American centric, that it serves those people best and not the whole population of the globe holistically. Further is the idea of the debate between universalism and cultural relativism. So because human rights are universal, universalism argues that rights can be applied to anybody regardless of where they are located, whereas cultural relativism argues that societies, cultures, and religions and other aspects will hinder the ability for rights to be recognized. This comes through often in gendered issues for cultures that are basing their hierarchies and modalities of society based on a superiority of men over women and other gender identities. And then this is looking at the human rights, capital H, capital R, versus human rights, lowercase h, lowercase r. Human rights with capitals is the industry that has emerged from human rights. And so the UN system, the NGOs, the very institutionalized way of looking at human rights, whereas human rights with the capital letters are the overall encompassing language of the study. And then when we're looking at the practices that are emerging from restorative justice, we're talking about its foundations in traditional practices and indigenous knowledge. And so restorative justice comes from the native peoples of the US, of Canada, of New Zealand, of Australia, and so forth. And so it's very culturally and traditionally rooted. And then we're also looking at alterations of approaches based on needs and harms. And so within justice systems, education systems, medicine, we're looking at the needs and harms of people impacted rather than easy solutions like punishment, isolation, and so forth. We're also looking at efforts that focus on rebuilding and repairing community relationships and trust. And so the way that people interact with each other becomes the foundation of the practice. Other definitions that became really central to the project is looking at the difference between harm reduction and prefigurative change making. And so this emerges from Ashley Bohr's chapter in Wicked Problems, Austin Troy Fitzpatrick's book. And this argues that we have two ways to approach change making. We could either focus on harm reduction, so reducing harm in the here and now and the immediate, or prefigurative change making, which is looking to create this utopia where harm cannot exist. And so these argue that there's two separate approaches. They could act together simultaneously, but we need to be cognizant of which one we are seeking to approach. And then, as we all know, there's the dichotomy of top-down and bottom-up initiatives. And so top-down initiatives come through the government and systems like the UN. Bottom-up initiatives come through the community, through grassroots, and so forth. And then also came up the definitions of descriptive and prescriptive change-making. And so this comes from social movement theory created by John Paul Lederach. And so descriptive change-making is working at the interpersonal relationship level. And so where is conflict or harm emerging from as people interact with one another? Whereas prescriptive change-making looks at what aspects of society, of policy, politics, the economy, and systems are creating conflict and harm, and how are those emerging and being addressed. So using all of these definitions, I created the analysis framework shown here. And so on the top, you have human rights, and on the bottom, restorative practice as a spectrum. And then on the left, you have harm reduction, the right prefigurative as a separate spectrum that intersects with the original. And then each box contains either top-down or bottom-up, prescriptive and descriptive, based upon how it is affiliated with our understanding of either traditional human rights or restorative practices. And so the top right quadrant, top-down prescriptive, is traditional human rights and prefigurative change-making. The bottom left is bottom-up, descriptive transformation associated with restorative practices and harm reduction. And so these two quadrants become the silos with which we engage in peace building. And so this paper uses a comparative analysis to examine case studies released by UNFPA over the last 20 years. And so I examined 40 case studies from 2008 to 2023 and plotted them on the chart to see how they were aligning, to see are they falling into the silos that I hypothesized they will. And so I chose UNFPA because they are indicative of the approaches of other UN offices and international organizations. This is because they often collaborate with offices like UN Women and UNICEF. And so it shows a holistic understanding of what the normative approaches within the UN system are. So as I mentioned, I analyzed 40 cases and plotted them accordingly. And so I used a coding system of top down would be +1, going above, bottom up would be -1, and then prescriptive would be +1, descriptive would be -1. And based on what they were coded as, they were plotted. Now, not every case was straightforward. There were some where I had to take an average choice. So for the 2018 case studies, they were split into 5 separate sections. And so of the 5, if 3 were top down, then it would receive a +1. And so as I hypothesized, most of the cases rely on a siloed approach. So it's either traditional human rights and prefigurative or restorative practice and harm reductive, which surprising to me, they were almost equal. And I think that is to push back a bit on the UN system being only top down and prescriptive. I think a lot of this comes from the desire to be either one or the other rather than a both and approach. And so the findings of this indicate that there's a preliminary pattern and that this pattern can be further analyzed to discuss why do we exist within either or way of approaching advocacy rather than looking all-encompassingly at a both and. So again, while the majority of the cases fell into those 2 silos, there were 6 outlier case studies from the 40 that I had analyzed. And so these cases either took a top-down descriptive approach or a bottom-up prescriptive approach. In the discussion section of my paper, I looked at each case more specifically to see what can we pull away from them as a complementary approach within both the classroom and practice understanding of international advocacy. And so these cases included the United Republic of Tanzania, the Philippines, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Guinea-Bissau. And so within these cases, we saw that they focused on meeting the needs of the people while also advocating for policy change or working with the government to be able to better connect and build trust within their communities. This is so important to consider as tangible option to how we approach advocacy, because we are seeing a global trend towards conservatism. And so we're at a time when funding is being cut and we're not sure what projects will continue moving forward. And so we need to re-examine how we approach peace building. If we limit ourselves to the specific silos, we're limiting our ability to engage in international advocacy that is effective and has positive outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, this project emerged out of a dissertation proposal for doctoral studies, and so the research is not done. The findings show that there's a preliminary pattern, but there's room to explore new and creative solutions when we approach international advocacy. And so for the next steps, I will be continuing this research as a doctoral student at the University of Manitoba in the fall of this year. And I have a few options of how I could approach research going forward. And so I would love anybody's opinion on how you think I should go about this. And so I could examine more cases from UNFPA, expanding my time frame and looking at other case studies that came out within those years, because there are plenty. I could examine cases from other UN offices and international advocates. And so that could look like UN Women and UNICEF, or I could shift to Human Rights Watch and other large NGOs. Or I could start examining other silos of peace building. Is this something that is limited to human rights and restorative justice, or does this emerge within other fields? So thank you all for letting me share this glimpse into my research, where it's gone, where it will be going, and start talking about a topic that I'm really passionate about. I think that silos have an important place within our way of studying and practicing, but I also do not think we should limit ourselves to engaging only in siloed peace building. And so I hope this sparks some ideas or questions about how this shows up within your work and studies. If you have any questions, comments, or want to read the full paper, feel free to email me. My email is right on the slide. And again, thank you so much.
So the next person, I guess, will be Anna. So thank you so much for joining us from Rio.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Topher, are you sharing my slides?
Oh, right. Yeah. Yep. Sorry. I am at your disposal. One moment. Oh. There we go.
Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Anna. I am presenting my research from Rio today. So to a certain extent, every research is a work in progress, and it's always a work in progress, and it feels like it's never completely done. But I am really halfway through writing my project right now. I am graduating in August, and I'll continue writing in the next couple months. So every criticism or suggestions that may come out of this presentation will be very much welcome and maybe incorporated into my writing and my revising as I continue the research. So on the second slide, we just have an outline of the presentation. We can move on to the third slide. Yeah. My research focuses on the phenomenon of liminality in protection. The project was born out of this recurrent observation I made during academic and professional encounters with the field of protection in general, which is that discourses of protection that are portrayed as universal in the sense that they are meant to protect all of humanity and politically neutral and morally good, they sometimes end up sustaining practices that lie in between protection and abandonment, between safeguarding rights and violating rights, preserving human life and abandoning it to political, social, or symbolic violence. So liminality is understood here as a condition of in-betweenness, as a third space between full protected status as a victim, a refugee, a civilian, and the dehumanization that authorizes violations of fundamental rights, abject forms of violence, and even killing. So my discussion of liminality focuses on one specific practice, which is indefinite detention. Indefinite detention has been widely debated in the context of the American War on Terror, And it is for good reason that both instances of liminality that I discuss in my research have been compared to Guantanamo, each in its specific way. But it is important to note that indefinite detention is not necessarily a liminal practice in the context of the War on Terror, for example. The fundamental rights and dignity and often physical integrity of those that were indefinitely detained was justified on the basis of protection, but the protection of others. And so you indefinitely detain some to protect others. But in these two cases, these two instances that I'm discussing in my research, detention is justified, at least in part, on the basis of the protection of those who are indefinitely detained. So moving on to slide number 4. Why protection discourses? In this research, in my research, I am subscribing to a post-structuralist definition of discourse that is influenced by Foucault. And in this context, discourse is understood as a group of statements that make up a general field containing rules about what the world is and how to act in it. So discourses demarcate what is considered intelligible, possible, reasonable, and legitimate in terms of knowledge and in terms of practice. And for this reason, discourse is seen as inseparable from the ways of acting in the world that they legitimize. Right? So in post-structuralist discourse analysis, we look at textual and non-textual, that is social practices. And both these practices are going to be discussed in my research. My object of analysis are discourses of protection, and by discourses of protection, I am referring to a heterogeneous body of rules that have as its raison d'etre the preservation of life. This body of rules includes international human rights law, international humanitarian law, refugee law, protection of civilians, responsibility to protect, human security, humanitarianism. So moving on to slide, my attempt to understand liminality has been guided by 2 questions. The first one is, how are objects of protection conceptualized in discourses of protection? So how do these discourses draw the line between protected humanity on the one hand and abandoned inhumanity on the other? The most straightforward and also the most recurrent answer that I have gotten from the literature on the different elements of this discursive ensemble of protection is that each of these discourses have to negotiate between the intention of universality and the reality of difference. And they do this through a threefold partition of humanity. So humanity in this context is divided between, first, the subjects of protection, those who protect, the saviors that are modeled after the liberal Western white man. And then we have what Costas Osinas will call suffering humanity. And then suffering humanity is divided into 2 groups as well. We have the helpless victim, who is the object of protection. They are portrayed as perfect victims, naturalized bodies as the women and children without agency and without guilt. And then you have the detractors of humanity, who are portrayed as savages, barbarians, uncivilized, inhuman. They are the enemy of humanity and the reason why protection is necessary. On slide 6, we have research question number 2, which is, how does this threefold partition of humanity pave the way for the production of liminal categories that are relegated to this third space between protection and disposability, inclusion and exclusion from the space, the discursive space of protected humanity? So my argument is that the objects of protection, and it varies according to each of these discourses, it may be the civilian, the refugee, the women and children victims of violence, all these these categories, these protected categories, they are conceptualized through binary distinctions between good and evil, victim and perpetrator. And these binaries are constantly challenged by the complex reality of human behavior, of social relations, and individual and collective histories. And when eventually complex figures blur the line separating the protected humanity from the dehumanized other, they are assigned to this third space through a condition of in-betweenness. And it is in this context that the two instances of liminality help understand how this partition can and is destabilized, and how protection discourses respond with new modes of categorization that merge the rationality of protection with the rationality of abandonment. On slide 7, we have a photo of one of the first holding facilities in South Sudan, and this is the first instance of liminality that I'm discussing. The holding facilities existed in the original configuration of the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan before they were transitioned to a more traditional IDP camp structure as they are right now. But originally, the POC sites were created as a response to internal displacement during the South Sudanese Civil War, and they were hosted and managed by the UN mission in South Sudan. So they were a little bit different, especially in terms of security management, to traditional refugee and IDP camps. Between 2014 and 2020, the UN mission detained people who committed serious offenses or who were considered a threat to the security of the POC sites. And they were held in makeshift detention centers, improvised out of shipping containers. They were called holding facilities. The detainees were referred to as holdees, never as detainees. Detainees was by then already a problematized category due to the to war on terror debates. Almost 6,000 people were detained in holding facilities between 2014 and 2020, some for a few days, some for a few years. So detention was extra legal in this context because the UN did not have a mandate to make arrests and carry out legal proceedings. But at the same time, detention was framed as a decision on which right to violate. The mission feared that transferring detainees to state authorities would be the same as returning victims of persecution to their persecutors, and that living conditions in state-controlled prisons might be below international standards, even though living conditions within the holding facilities were also below international standards. And then we have the particular situation of a particular group in refugee and IDP camps in Syria. Yeah, that is correct on the next slide. Thank you. The majority of the population in these two camps in Syria, Roj and Al-Hol, are Syrian IDPs and Iraqi refugees. But the camps also hold a smaller group of residents of other nationalities that are referred to as third country nationals, not as refugees. And the TCNs, they have this slippery status. They are separated from the rest of the population of the camps. Their living conditions have been described as violent and unsanitary. There are additional security measures in place in the section of Al-Hol that holds the TCNs, which is called the annex. I have circled there in the aerial view of Al-Hol where the annex is. It is physically separated from the rest of the camp. And these security measures have limited the movement and access to humanitarian services for TCNs. They have become de facto detainees. And their specificity as a group is that they are mostly women and children whose adult male family members have been imprisoned for association with ISIL. So TCNs have not been charged or prosecuted for crimes of terrorism, but paradoxically, they don't have the same rights and protections guaranteed to those who have been accused, arrested, and prosecuted for these crimes. Their countries of nationality, mostly European countries, are moving to revoke their citizenship, so repatriation is not an option either. And basically, TCNs face the prospect of indefinite detention in spaces that are meant to be spaces of protection. And then finally, on slide 9, I bring it's basically a temporary argumentation, a temporary answer for research question number 2, which is a reflection on how what these two liminal categories have to say about protection and its occasional confusion with abandonment. I'm still developing the research, but the answer that I would offer at this point is that protection discourses produce categories of inclusion. These are the civilian, in the case of protection of civilians, refugee, the IDP, the woman and child, the victims of violence, and persecution. And then you have the categories of exclusion, the enemy of humanity, the inhuman perpetrator or persecutor. And then you have figures like the HODIs and the TCNs that do not respond to these clean-cut lines dividing humanity. They embody aspects of both victim and perpetrator. The HODIs, for example, resist the conflation of vulnerability with innocence. They are not innocent, making it impossible for them to be categorized as either victims of crimes against humanity or barbarians threatening humanity. The TCNs confuse this coupling of women and children with innocence through their complicated relationship with ISIL supporters. So the ambiguity of their positions on a clean-cut scheme that separates protected humanity from inhumanity, the inhuman other, are a result of the fact that they destabilize the partition of humanity, and discourses of protection respond to this through categorical innovations. They are HODIs instead of detainees, they are TCNs instead of refugees. And these categorical innovations have very material consequences for these people. They find themselves at the receiving end of practices that merge protection with abandonment and violation. So this is where I'm at right now. I very much appreciate your time. And if you have any criticisms, questions, those will be very welcomed.
Fantastic. I love it. It's such a rich couple of cases what Anna has done with them. Moving on to our next speaker, we have Stella Desiree Bosch. She is, I have to say that I kind of plug the MASHA program, the Humanitarian Action Program here, which we oftentimes, those of us involved in the residential programs don't see because the people are not physically on campus for the most part. But Stella, as you can see, she is a flesh and blood person. She just happens to live in. And I also wanted to just call attention to the attendance of Rob Grace, who's one of the faculty members for the MASHA program. Thank you, Rob, for joining us. He's recently of Brown University, now the lead researcher at Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict. And I believe, Stella, you've maybe had him in a humanitarian diplomacy class. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Topher. I can start?
Yes, please.
Okay. You can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, let me try to get mine back. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Stella Bosch. I'm a Master of Science in Humanitarian Action student at the Kroc School. This is my final semester. 6 months ago, I joined the Honors Project as an opportunity to design and carry out independent research around a critical question in humanitarian and development aid. My thesis centers on this. As age legitimacy falters, could grassroots international NGOs or GINGOs help bridge the gap towards sustainable localization if INGOs let them in? Gingos are nonprofits registered in economically powerful countries. They often operate across borders and are deeply involved with the communities they support. They foster long-term relationships, local knowledge, and personal commitments, and most are volunteer-run and loosely structured compared to professionalized INGOs. Gingos tend to operate where support systems are thin, cultivating relationships with these communities over time. Most operate outside formal humanitarian and development structures. They bring something essential: deep trust, sustained presence, and proximity to the ground. I co-founded a Gingo called Tractable. It's registered in France and active in Cambodia since 2011. That experience motivated this research, but the findings reflect many voices, not just my own. So to set the stage, let's look more closely at who these actors are and what's really at stake in the localization debate. So before I get into theory and findings, I want to quickly lay out who's involved and what's shaping the conversation on localization and power. INGOs are large, internationally based, and usually well-resourced. They've got the infrastructure, the systems, and most of the fundings. LNGOs are the local NGOs, community-rooted, but often underfunded and excluded from decisions, even when the project's about them. Gingos, which I mentioned earlier, are entities registered in one country, but working in another. Many are volunteer-led, with deep ties and long-term presence. I'm exploring how these might make localization more sustainable, especially where formal systems fall short. Localization means shifting power and decisions closer to the people the aid serves. Sustainability is about trust, relevance, and continuity, not just funding. And the grand bargain, that was a 2016 donor pledge to get 25% of aid directly to local actors. But we're well under that. So here's how I approached my research. To analyze the findings, I drew on three core lenses. First, Bourdieu's theory of capital, fields, and symbolic violence, which helped me understand how legitimacy is constructed in the aid sector, and why some actors are perceived as credible while others are dismissed, even when they're deeply involved. Second, post-colonial critiques on development, drawing on Escobar, Kapoor, and Spivak, helped me to critically analyze what inclusion actually means and how it can sometimes be symbolic rather than transformative. And finally, network governance theory. Oh, sorry, yeah. Did you have all three? There you go. Sorry. And finally, network governance theory from Povak and Kennis helped to explain how coordination often relies on formal structure and more on trust, relationships, and informal roles. These three concepts give me structure to the analysis and help me connect the literature and interviewees' narratives to broader patterns of power and exclusion. So the methodology is, this research began as a comparative study. I was originally focused on Gingos and INGOs in small island nations, looking at how they engage with localization. Despite growing climate vulnerability, I chose these settings because they're often overlooked in debates and literature. The interviews, strong relational connections emerged from the grassroots, but INGOs were hard to reach. It quickly became clear the dynamic was more complex than I had anticipated, and a binary comparison may not fit the study's scope. I expanded the research and added Madagascar, hoping to connect with more INGOs, but access remained limited, and pointing to deeper systemic issues. In the end, I conducted 9 structured interviews. 2 INGO workers I connected with through the Kroc network, 1 UN staff member, 4 gingos, and 2 local NGO leaders. To deepen the analysis and connect academic framing with field realities, the study also draws on over 50 sources, including peer-reviewed articles, sector podcasts, and practitioner material. This shift moved the project from a fixed comparison to an open explanatory inquiry, which focuses on legitimacy, collaboration, sustainability, all grounded in the realities of who responds, who's included, and who speaks. So here's what I heard. No? Sorry. Where's my slide? Voila. Too far. Sorry about this. Here's what I heard. Okay. So Lisa is a Gingo director in Capo Verde. And what stands out in this moment isn't just her organization is active. It's that she's recognized, welcome, trusted. And the kids' faces light up when when they see her return. That's not visibility, and that's presence. This reflects what Bourdieu describes as relational capital, legitimacy that's earned over time through continuity and emotional proximity. It also connects to what Provan and Kenneth describe in network governance theory, that collaboration isn't just a matter of formal structure, but of trust, familiarity, and repeated interaction. In Lisa's case, legitimacy wasn't built through an official partnership or branded materials. It came from being there again and again. So this slide looks at how legitimacy isn't always earned, it's often assigned. Anik, a Gingo director in Comoros, described how newly arrived INGOs were quickly positioned as lead coordinators, despite her team's existing presence and work on the ground for years. It wasn't about capacity, it was about perception. Steve, a former INGO staff member and advisor, echoed this, explaining that local and Gingo actors often end up doing the cultural translation, but still aren't seen as experts. He noted that communities tend to be skeptical of organizations that haven't invested in long-term relationships. This reflects what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital, legitimacy that comes from affiliating, branding, or language, not from embedded knowledge or trust. The interviews highlight how professional identities still outweigh real experiences, even in fields claiming localization. Okay, here I bring together 2 of my strongest critiques I interviewed. They're grounded in deep field experience, and both offer a clear view of how power still operates in the aid system. Rota, a UN staff member, described what he calls as the same colonial dynamic. Local actors might be in the room, but big actors do the talking. The result is visibility without voice. Lynn, a Gingo founder in Vanuatu, echoed this from another angle. Despite being embedded in local communities, she describes how recognition still revolves around size, status, and external validation. Her words, that the structures still function with a colonial mindset, reflect what many but rarely say out loud. This is where tokenism becomes real, when inclusion exists on paper, but not in power. It's exactly what post-colonial theorists like Spivak and Escobar warn about, that even progressive language and action can mask systems that marginalize. So this is a quote from Paulo. It captures something that tends to be overlooked in the localization debate. Being a local NGO leader in Capo Verde and a former Olympic athlete, he works and engages with communities daily. He partners with a Gingo, but told me he may not be seen as a strategic partner by INGOs. As he puts it, to partner with the big ones, we have to be the big ones too. He also noted that INGOs prioritize partnerships with national governments, not with community organizations, bypassing actors who've already cultivated trust and continuity. It reinforces a pattern where legitimacy flows upwards, not outwards. Bourdieu's field theory helps to explain this. Aid actors don't compete on equal terms. Recognition, visibility, and access are shaped by where you stand in the system, not just by what you do. Gingos often sit between these layers. They're more embedded in the communities than INGOs, but not big enough to be seen as real partners. And that gap, the space where trust meets invisibility, is where I believe the sector is missing the point. This visual summarizes what nearly all my interviewees touched on from different positions. The aid system does not reward trust, continuity, or proximity. It rewards credentials, compliance, and metrics. This is why INGOs dominate, not just in funding, but in shaping the agenda. Their economic capital is visible, reportable, and donor-friendly. INGOs operate on financial capital, Gingos on social capital earned through presence and proximity, not rigid frameworks. And while essential, social capital remains undervalued in a system that equates legitimacy with scale and compliance. I acknowledge that Gingos may also replicate exclusion, especially if they mirror institutional behaviors prioritizing control and visibility. But in this research, what came through the discourses was humility. Not an extension of colonial structures, but a quiet resistance to them. They walked with, not over. That trust makes room for something INGOs often struggle to foster: critical thinking. Not just compliance, but reflection, question, and ownership. Critical thinking doesn't happen through systems. It grows through continuity. Several Gingos shared stories of children they once supported returning years later as volunteers, professionals, or peers. That's not a project outcome. That is a cycle being broken. In creating space for reflection, Gingos can quietly support a kind of reversed colonization, not in power, but in thought. A return to local way of knowing, naming, and deciding. A refusal to accept what has been inherited as the only way forward. This is not just localization. It's the slow undoing of inherited fear. It's the people shaped by generations of trauma, colonial legacy, and survival who begin to ask different questions and believe they are allowed to. So this model reflects a major opportunity the sector continues to overlook. INGOs bring scale and access. LNGOs bring proximity and trust. But Gingos, community-rooted and globally aware, are rarely seen as strategic actors. A 2021 study found that only 7% of the US-based Gingos had ever partnered formally with an INGO. This is not just a missed opportunity. It reveals a flaw in how the system is designed. Gingos aren't marginal. They're active, numerous, and mostly entirely volunteer-driven. Every Gingo leader I interviewed personally covered their costs, airfare, housing, and time. Operating outside institutional budgets, they've learned to adapt, stay close, and remain flexible. These are the exact qualities the sector needs right now, as European donations are pulling back and the US aid agency is being dismantled. The Grand Bargain pledged 25% of funding to local actors. 8 years later, we're still below 5%. The gap isn't just financial, it's relational and structural. Gingos offer long-term trust without building scaffolding and fostering something most NGOs struggle to support: critical thinking. Not just consultation, but reflection, question, and ownership. By asking, listening, and staying, Gingos tend to exchange knowledge horizontally. INGOs, by contrast, often follow a vertical logic: design, deliver, exit. Because Gingos don't mirror institutional professionalism, they mostly excluded from strategic collaboration, even when they're closest to the communities aid is meant to serve. So if we want real localization to be sustained, we must start seeing what's already working. INGOs and Gingos each bring strengths, but bridging the gap will take more than presence or tools. It will take partnerships and courage to share power. Thank you.
We do have a question, at least one question online. And so I'll read it for those of you in the room. I will read it out. Those of you online can read it for yourselves, but this is from Dustin Sharp, professor here. Need to go, but I'm going to drop in a question for Anna Carolina and Madison. There's now a long, but obviously Madison can't respond to this, so it's a little bit of a, so this falls squarely just on you. There's now a long tradition critiquing human rights practice and discourse, questioning their universality and neutrality, whether they serve empire or harm the people they're trying to help, promote non-constructive binaries, and so on. Many of those critiques seem premised on the idea that human rights are some kind of hegemonic force and that they're deployed more in service to power than as a check on power. Those critiques had a special relevance in 1995, 2005, and maybe even in 2015, but what about 2025? In a world where democracy and rights are in retreat, is the worry really still the hegemony of rights and problematic binaries? Is there a role for scholars in sustaining the international human rights project at a time when they are more under threat than they have been since the Cold War? Something that goes beyond the critique. So, Anna, do you want to respond to that?
Do you want me to answer first, or do we do the round of questions and then return for answers?
I think we can respond now. If you have something to say now, you don't have to.
No, I don't think I have a final answer. And this is honestly one question that kind of I don't want to say tormented me, but kind of did. And this it still does, as I'm still in the process of building this thesis, which is exactly that. We are in a moment where we have seen the shrinking of rights, and in many places, including Brazil, we have also seen the far right grow and questioning this benign body of norms and of policies seems kind of outdated or kind of out of touch with reality sometimes, and it can look this way. But one thing that I also always try to hold on to is first the fact that one thing being problematic and violent does not exclude the violence and the problematic of the other thing. And there's also the fact that these are practices that I'm looking at that are problematic and that refer to a limbo that can show us a way to ameliorate those discourses of protection, I'm looking at what I'm calling liminal categories, and they kind of, they are a denunciation of blind spots in those norms, and we need to address those blind spots. Some practices, like the holding facilities, some spaces like the holding facilities and the practice of indefinite detention in this context, they have since been translated into policy making for UN peacekeeping. So as these exceptional practices gain force and gain materiality in discourse, we need to be looking more attentively to what they reveal about those discourses and how they make sense of objects of protection and subjects of protection and who is not protected.
Thank you. I think it looks like Rob has a question.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, great to hear your voice.
Oh, great. Cool. It's good. It's good to see you all. I'm gonna keep my video off because I'm like in my car wearing jogging clothes, and so it's a little crazy right here. But I'm glad I got to join. Great job, everyone. Very impressed with the presentations. I'm gonna throw a question to Stella. Stella, great job to you as well. Certainly an important topic. I think you did a great job manifesting some of that productive friction that Topher mentioned at the beginning of the session, of putting theory in conversation with your research findings and what's actually going on in the real world. And I just couldn't help but ponder, since we have both wrapped up recently humanitarian diplomacy together, many of the ideas and themes, and especially the third theoretical framework that you're engaging with, we're touching on a lot that we also were engaging with in humanitarian diplomacy. Notions of trust, legitimacy, credentials. And my question for you is, I'm interested to hear your reflections on the extent to which you might see practical value in some of the negotiation tools that we explored in humanitarian diplomacy in terms of addressing this issue that you're talking about, that you've done research on. In what ways do you see potentially or not some room for practical use of negotiation tools in engagements between local organizations, grassroots organizations, and the international humanitarian system, to maybe as a means of empowering local organizations? I suppose that's my question. I'll leave it there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's definitely makes sense. It's very, thank you for asking it. I actually was thinking a lot about the class as I was preparing my presentation. So, yes, which tools? I don't know. I think there's a lot of, as I've been joining the whole MASHA program, I feel that, talking, being close to the communities is a discourse which is happening anyway in the MASHA program, very exploratory. It was also one I shared with Jim in my disaster and management and I think resilience course. And also with you, how trust is important to build. I'm not sure, from what I understand from the little research I have done, because I only interviewed nine people, which is not that much. How the GINGO and INGO relationship would work, because for me it's mostly absent, and it's for what I got from my research as well. I mean, I had a lot of enthusiasm from the INGO leaders that I interviewed about GINGOs, but there's definitely one issue which is problematic, which is that they are not registered in the most of them are not registered in the countries where they operate. So that was a difficulty for them. I think it's a lot also to do with the donor accountability, which makes it also difficult to explain that. I think that trust aspect to donors. But I don't know if I answered your question, but definitely your course was on my mind throughout throughout writing this. For sure, is the more you know about your negotiation practices and aspects and how you can approach, I can only assume that the richer it becomes and the more the conversations can open. I think it's all about that. It's trying to meet someone where the conversation's open. And I'm very surprised I touch this subject because I'm very surprised. I just feel that everyone has this, in the aid industry, sort of has the same end goal. It's just because we go about it differently. We're just not meeting. So yeah, it's something that touches me. I don't know, Rob, if I answered your question correctly.
No, it's all good. Thank you for your comments. It's all very interesting. All very interesting to ponder. So again, great
To
work.
be honest, I've been so overwhelmed with this research that your class, even though it was just a couple of weeks ago, it feels very far.
Yeah, it does for me too.
I'll go back
actually,
to my
oddly enough.
modules and I will send you an email and let you know.
Anyway, thank you very much.
This is great, and I will just sort of interject that I assume that, you know, we will start seeing perhaps a rise in the importance of the roles of ginkgos over the next few months as economic capital declines amongst the sort of the international set. The importance of social capital may be on the rise. With that, we are almost precisely at our limit, so I don't mean to cut us off, but I do mean to cut us off. I want to thank you all so much for the enormous amount of work that went into each and every one of these projects, these honors projects. I'm sorry, Caitlin, I haven't given you a peer review yet because you asked me not to.
You could have quit. It's okay. Whatever you want to, you can.
If I can do it now, I'll do it now.
Yeah.
Everybody else should have those from me. I will be around and available. I would love to see you over the last few steps before you turn in the final. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you so much, all. Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Topher, for the technical support during my presentation as well.
Sorry for jumping the gun there a few times.
No, you do great guesses.
Right, see you.
Bye.
Thank you.
You can just read the original and then